Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 4. Firstly, I'm sorry that we're a couple of days late uploading the video and the lecture this week. I've had a bit of a kidney infection this week, and it's really knocked me around. But one of the joys about normally getting them up so ridiculously early is we can still get them up today to give you plenty of time before your tutorials next week to absorb the lecture content and do the homework and so on and so forth. A little bit of news for me. I got a short story accepted for publication this week in a journal called Cordite. And what I wanted to talk about that with you that was a very inelegantly phrased, wasn't it? Is that Cordite is normally a poetry journal. But what I submitted was a fairly short story. So it was about 1,000 and a bit words in quite an experimental voice. So it almost crosses the line between a short story and prose poetry. And so one bit of, this is a paying market, by the way, you get paid. Cordite's very highly respected. One of the things that I'd encourage you to do when you're looking to send out your short stories, and hopefully you do send your short stories out for publication. We'll be talking about publication markets a little bit later this semester. But you can cast your net a little bit wider as well. You can think about other places where it might fit. I had a crazy friend, and still do have, by the name of Anita Bell, who you may have heard of. She's a local writer. And she set herself the goal of writing a short story every week for a year, just because she's kind of a little bit insane. And to get those short stories published, she not only approached the kind of the likely short story markets, but she also approached things like, you know, the Toowoomba Tractor Monthly magazine and said, hey, I've written a short story about a tractor. Would you like to include that in your magazine? And the magazine went, we've never included a short story before, but yeah, sure, why the heck not? And the nice thing about that was they didn't know how to pay for short stories, so they just paid her for like a normal article. And she ended up getting dozens and dozens of short stories published that year. So do think a little bit outside the box of traditional publishers as well, where when you're submitting your short stories, because that's one thing that I did, and I had a little bit of a win from that this week. Now, some housekeeping tasks, firstly. So firstly, you're being asked now to fill in the standard critique sheet in your tutorials for the work that's coming up for critique in a particular week. Now, that standard critique sheet can be found in this week's folder. So it's in the week 4 folder on Blackboard. And it can also be found under assessment. So if you go to the peer review assessment item on Blackboard, you'll see that the template is there as well. So that's one thing you'll find. Now, I had a request from a student that we also make the tutorial slides available to you all. This isn't something we've done in the past, but I had a little bit of a think about it. And because we're online this semester, it makes a lot of sense to me. So I think that was actually a really good suggestion. So from this week, I will also be uploading the tutorial slides for the tutes, and I'll go and retrospectively put them in for the first 3 weeks as well. Now, your tutors may be modifying these slides in one way or another, so I'll just be uploading the default ones that I give to them. So it may not be exactly what you got in the tutorial if your tutor has modified it in some kind of way. Now, one of the questions that I got this week was about voice, which we talked about last week. But I thought it was a really good follow-up. By the way, I'm not going to go. I realized only after I recorded it last week that my video went for 16 minutes. I'm sorry, that's quite a long video, so I'm going to keep this one shorter for you as well. As I say, when I'm talking about things I'm really passionate about, I have a tendency to go on a little bit. So please forgive me that. But anyway, the question was basically, well, what are some of the things I can do to get a strong voice in my fiction? Some of them I talked about in the lecture, but I'll just briefly recap here some of the most powerful ways I think you can get to get a distinct voice for a short story. And again, this might not be your own natural voice. This might just be a voice that you're assuming for the purposes of the story to tell one particular story in one particular way. I think a great place to start when you're starting out with voice is just to find someone you love. Find what your favorite writer is, or someone who's written something that you really loved the sound or the style of, and that you'd really like to be able to sound like yourself. So find that and then copy it out by hand. Copy a few pages out with a pen in hand. It doesn't work for some reason as well if you're typing it. Again, intuitively, this really helps you get into the voice of the author and then mimic it. So then just try to write something new or continue on in writing in that voice. Now, the chances are you won't be able to capture that voice completely, clinically, perfectly. So what you may well end up with is sort of a combination of that author's voice and something that's your own as well. And there's absolutely no shame in this. Mimicry of voice is a really well-established practice within creative writing, and any number of famous writers have done it. And particularly writers like I mentioned in the lecture, sorry, my dogs are barking. I mentioned in the lecture Peter Carey and True History of the Kelly Gang. He found written documents from the time and shamelessly mimicked the voice to actually get that, which is why it sounds so different from his other novels. The other thing I would suggest to do also is to read it aloud. And if it sounds like someone else speaking, does this sound like you speaking naturally? Or does this sound like someone else speaking? Are there particular lines when you say them that sound like someone else or more like you? That might give you a good idea of where to edit the piece. Reading something aloud is an often given piece of advice. And it's a very, very, very good piece of advice. But to ramp that up a notch, here's a lesser given piece of advice, which is have somebody read your work to you. When you hear your words come out of someone else's mouth, and if you've ever written a script, you know this experience, they interpret the work in a different way to what you intended. They add their own thinking and emphasis to it. And lines that are bad will sound especially bad. They'll be really clunky and really highlighted for you. Lines that work well or that they've spun in a particular way, you'll know to keep. So have somebody you love and someone who's patient with you read your work aloud to you, I think is just an absolute gold piece of advice. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. As I said, I'll keep it a little bit shorter this week. Thanks again for bearing with a couple of days lateness. One thing I'd like to encourage you to do, please, is please feel free to drop in on our drop-in sessions. Again, they run Mondays from 9 till 10 a.m. And you can find the Zoom link for those drop-in sessions on Blackboard under the tutorial and Zoom links section. I'd love to see you there and have a one-on-one conversation with you as well. And please do send me questions. I love getting questions that I can talk about in these videos. Hit me up in any way that you would like to answer a question for you as I'm speaking here, because I'd love to hear from you and I'd love to hear what you're interested in knowing about as well. Okay, that's all from me this week. I hope you're having a great week and I hope you enjoyed this week.